G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 18 ahead of the Qatar Grand Prix this coming weekend. As always, if you're new around here, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. So I've had a brief hiatus from YouTube the last couple of weeks following Japan. Been on the road but back now in New York and looking to push out a fair bit of content between now and this coming sprint race. There's a lot to digest and dissect ahead of a very critical juncture for not just our fantasy teams, but obviously Max with the World Drivers' Championship. That could be locked up this weekend. So I think there's quite a bit of information we need to look at. Before we get into it, however, I do want to call out FanAmp. They've been an enormous supporter of the show here on the channel, where you can see that it's powered by them. And as part of my, partnership with the Fantasy Formula show we have on YouTube every single race week, we're doing a $50 giveaway for 5th Gear Garms. They do F1 merchandise, a lot of high quality merchandise. So if you want to enter into this competition for this giveaway, all you have to do is download the FanAmp app. The links are in the description below, and comment in the Fantasy Formula base on the app who you think scores more fantasy points this weekend between Checo and Carlos Sainz. Your answer doesn't even have to be right. All you have to do to enter is submit who you think is going to come out on top. On top of that, if you win, you also get to choose what you want to call my fantasy team for 1 week. So as you can see here on the screen, my team one name is Verstappen GOAT. Usually is F1 Fantasy Hub, but the winner from last week decided to rename my team that. Hopefully Matt can put in a GOAT-worthy performance in Qatar as my DRS boost. But yeah, FanAmp, a massive supporter of the channel, so check them out if you want to engage with me in real time on a day-to-day basis to have all your fantasy questions answered. So anyway, let's take a look at how my team did in Japan. I know it's been like quite some time now between the race and this video, but let's just want to quickly review that before we get into what my team looks like for the upcoming race. So I finished with 240 points all out, a pretty disappointing weekend for me, unfortunately. There was a lot of discussion around whether Checo or Sainz was going to be in that second premium driver slot. I went with Checo, but fortunate for me in that respect, a lot of the engaged strategists also had that. If you didn't, you ended up with Carlos Sainz. He didn't have an amazing race by any means, but still came out on top between those two drivers. So that was, I guess, one element to a downside. And look, it was a pretty underwhelming performance across the board from Checo. His qualifying performance wasn't that bad, but he was off Max by 8/10 in qualifying. In a car like that, I definitely don't think the gap should be anywhere close to that. And then just a myriad of errors across the weekend. Overtook a car entering the pit lane under a safety car. He blocks Lando Norris under the virtual safety car, and then pretty much T-boned K-Mag and spun him around in the middle of the race. It was a pretty clumsy overtake there, kind of the kind of overtake you'd see in a video game, and then you just bounce off the car and continue on down the road. I just don't know why Checo decided to wait until a straight to breeze past that Haas. So pretty poor from him, and I think he's just putting so much pressure on himself at the moment, so much unnecessary pressure, which is obviously culminating in these performances. So look, I don't know what this means for him into Qatar moving forward. There's obviously some optimism around Red Bull because it's a circuit that should suit them with the straights and the high-speed corners. But the fact that, you know, he's had so many errors throughout this season, all for the same driver as well, and not to mention the whole Red Bull unretiring the car to serve the penalty, it's just a schmozzle for him at the moment. So I'm a little skeptical about him in my team this weekend. Obviously, we only have one practice session worth of data to go off, so I'd want to see some sign of encouragement to suggest he's going to be in my team, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But yeah, not a great weekend for him. The other four for me was Logan Sargent. Now, he had a DNF, not just in the race, which was a -20, but he also got hit with a -5 in qualifying as well, because he crashed. And it's just much like Checo, a driver that's putting so much unnecessary pressure on themselves, which I think is getting to his head. He's making these mistakes, And I keep thinking, and this was the logic I went for in Japan, that he's going to outgrow these areas. He's going to have that race that we think in that Williams he is capable of, but he just doesn't seem to have that level of consistency that we're seeing from other rookies or other budget drivers. Lawson's been out of the blocks the last few races, certainly for a driver that's only been behind the wheel of that AlphaTauri for a couple. And then, Joe's Mr. Consistent. And then Hulkenberg, even though he's known for his flaws in fantasy, is still putting in decent performances most of the time. So Sargent has that inherent DNF risk more than anyone else on the grid, I think, right now. And I was hoping that he wouldn't, put himself in that position, but that's kind of what screwed me over in Japan, and as a result was probably the driving force between my rank being at 3.2k heading into that weekend and now sitting at 6.7. So I'm in a bit of a dilemma where I am deliberating how to structure my team this weekend with a couple of transfers in hand. We'll get to that again in a minute. But yeah, the two main flaws on my team were those two guys. Outside of that, pretty solid performance. The McLaren boys had a weekend to remember, both of them on the podium. That upswing in form has obviously coincided with Aston Martin's regression, and Alonso is pretty much out of the template for engaged strategists right now. They're obviously making a lot of progress, and for a car that we thought might have only been suited to certain circuits, they're certainly putting in results at a number of different ones, kind of like Ferrari as well at the moment. So, Lando's got a lot of incentive to keep pushing. He's chasing Charles Leclerc for 5th in the Constructors. And I definitely think that added confidence of, multiple second places for him is obviously a really good sign for him. As far as Oscar Piastri is concerned, he's had some really good qualifying performances lately. I think he's been pretty much toe-to-toe with Lando for the most part. And I was really hoping heading into Japan that he would be able to kind of pull it all together and deliver a podium. He finally got that. He started P2, finished P3. And I think he's been ahead of Lando at several times throughout the season, not just in qualifying, but on race 2. Even though Lando's obviously got that experience, I still think for what you're getting value-wise with Oscar, sensational. So I think not taking any way away from his performances with that driver of the day, if we just check out his scores there, qualifying positions, and then, pretty much just held that position throughout the race. So really good sign for Oscar, for the Australian. Again, the Fantasy Formula Show, as I mentioned before, I did have a bet with Adam at F1 Fantasy HQ that if we had an Australian on the podium this season, whether it was Ricciardo or Piastri, I'd do a shoey live on our next deadline stream, which is Qatar this weekend. So come through on Friday, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, US, 5 p.m. British Standard Time, I think. So if you want to see me do my best Ricciardo on a podium impression live on stream, be sure to drop by. Again, all the links are in the description below. So going back to my team. Oh dear, didn't mean to do that. We had 240 points. Red Bull, McLaren, pretty good across the board. So if we go into what my team's shaping up for this weekend, Max 2 times, Lando, Red Bull Racing, McLaren Constructor, not going anywhere in my team anytime soon. And I think Oscar is, with these continued price rises we're seeing from him every single race week, another driver you may as well hold on to ride those. The 2 points of contention for me are obviously those 2 guys I talked about before, Sergio Perez and Logan Sargent. Now, I'm in a really difficult situation where had I been on the 2 drivers I wanted, or 2 other drivers I was looking at last weekend in Carlos Sainz and Guan Yu Zhou, I'd have much more flexibility with how I want to structure my team heading into this weekend. Checo lost 0.5 million in value. Sargent lost 0.1 million in value because of those DNFs. That 0.6 total, coupled with the fact that Carlos went up, I think it was 0.3 and Joe went up 0.5, means that $1.4 million swing prices me out of having those 2 drivers for this weekend. Because of the limited cost cap I have available to me, there isn't really a lot in the way of flexibility if we just sort the guys by value. I'd say there's 0 flexibility for that matter. So I only have Sargent to choose from because Hulk also went up 0.5 after his 10-point performance last weekend. So I'm in a really difficult situation where I go with the lineup I had last weekend, roll a transfer into the following weekend, or I pivot to a Carlos Sainz and whatever else I can afford at that price bracket. They're the two options I'm deliberating with at the moment. Carlos has obviously had some really great drives recently and has outperformed Sergio every single weekend for I think the last 4 in a row. So he's the man in form. Objectively over the season, Checo has been the better driver and the better fantasy performer too. But I'm not trying to take the lens that that's how how next race is going to play out based on the entire season. I think you've really got to look at form, the evolution of that Ferrari car and the performance of Carlos Sainz, not to mention he's much less riddled with errors at the moment. So I guess I'm kind of stuck here, and I know that Red Bull is going to be quite suited to the Qatar circuit. So do I want to take a risk with 2 out of form drivers? And there are going to be people with more budget than me. So you could be going for someone like Perez and Yuki Tsunoda or Liam Lawson, and I think that's a pretty viable option for sure. I don't have that, so if I don't go with those 2 guys, it probably will be someone like Carlos Sainz, and then that leaves me just enough to sneak in Yuki Tsunoda. So again, Tsunoda, another driver that hasn't exactly been out of this world lately. He's had, before Japan, 2 back-to-back DNFs, but then he's also had performances where you're kind of seeing like the mid-teens performances, low-teens performances, and he does have a tendency to do quite well at sprint races. I think there's more at stake, so he's willing to be that little bit more aggressive, and we know that he can be, on his day, a really competitive driver, willing to get his elbows out. So I think that's one lineup I'm certainly looking at. The issue is that if Perez goes up in price, then that potentially prices me out of him in the future. Again, it's all very speculative, but I think that's kind of where my team's at right now. The other option I could look at is potentially George Russell in that slot, more for the consistency if anything else. And I don't think the Mercedes is going to be overly consistent at Qatar, but I guess something to think about for Ferrari is that there's going to be higher track temperatures. We're racing in the desert, and so that tyre degradation, which Ferrari have struggled with throughout the season, is probably going to be a factor. Now, I think, to my point earlier, Ferrari, the car has evolved over a number of races. They are competitive at several different types of circuits. McLaren have obviously followed suit to a certain extent as well. So does Ferrari, I guess, part of these performance upgrades over the last few weeks and performance improvements warrant or constitute, I guess, a translation to the degradation of those tyres over an entire race? I'm not so sure. Perez is a driver we know has a great habit of managing tyres over the course of a race. And obviously, even though we're racing at night time, I don't think that necessarily precludes the drivers or the tyres from being affected by the heat that much. I still think the track temperatures are going to be hot. So someone like Perez, even though he is struggling for form, may be able to do that little bit longer, those longer stints on those tyres. And if he does put in a qualifying performance on Friday, keep in mind it's a sprint race, so the deadline is a day early, that he may just want to push, let's say he ends up hypothetically in the top 4 in qualifying, he may just want to push a little bit longer on those tyres on race day, give him that confidence up the front, and then hopefully that puts him in a good position to contend for a podium down the line. So that's kind of what my team's looking like at the moment. There's obviously some reason to be made for using chips this weekend. I'm not going to get into it now because I will get out a final thoughts video before the deadline on Friday. But there is certain scope for the extra DRS boost and the limitless. I'm not so sure either of those chips make sense for me. Well, the extra DRS I already used in Austria. Limitless, it is expected and seen in practice that McLaren and Red Bull do as well as we anticipate. There's very little value to be had with using limitless if all engaged strategists are also on those assets already. You really want to be using that at a time where, say, Mercedes, which are much lower owned, or even Ferrari, much like we saw in Monza, are performing well in practice. But anyway, I'll digest that a little bit more in my preview and final thoughts video, so stay tuned for that. Just wanted to get some thoughts on paper for now, what my team's looking like. If your team is looking like this at all, looking differently, please let me know. I would love to hear if you've got any builds that I haven't really talked about, that are not quite on the meta, but you think could do well in Qatar. Drop them down in the comment below, and I can certainly give you some food for thought on what I reckon is viable there too. So guys, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you very soon. And please do like and subscribe to the channel. It means a great deal. Good luck with your teams this weekend, guys, and I'll see you again very soon.